Hey class, Mr. Costa here. Welcome to Chapter 10, Section 2, An End of Those Good Feelings. A few things you want to take a look at from this time period, stretching from about 1819 all the way to 1828. The first is a very important Supreme Court case entitled McCulloch versus Maryland. You see, James McCulloch is the head of the National Bank in Maryland. And head of it. Well, Maryland, looking for a way to make some extra money, decides to tax the national bank. James McCulloch is the head cashier, and so they challenge him to pay this tax. McCulloch says, no, I don't have to pay a tax to Maryland. So the case, McCulloch versus Maryland, goes to the Supreme Court, where John Marshall is going to hear the case. Marshall says that a state, Maryland, cannot tax a part of the national government, the national bank. He says that because the government found that the national bank was constitutional, was okay, that to tax it would be an attempt to kill it. And you can't tax something that they've already ordained. So, the key to this case is that it reaffirms the idea that the national government has authority over the states, and is a constant reminder to the states that the national government's the one calling the shots. McCulloch versus Maryland. Another key item from this time period is the Missouri Compromise. At this time in American history, there are the same number of states that are slave and free. If you notice here real quick, we have free states. Notice how many there are. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 free states. And over here there are 11 slave states. There is an equal balance between those areas. So it's really important to them to maintain that balance. However, things are going to cause a problem because once the state of Missouri decides that they want to come in as a free state, that's going to throw off the balance of free and slave. What part of the government is a balance of free and slave most important? That's right, the Senate, because there's 2 members per state. So right now there's 22 senators for slavery, 22 senators opposed to slavery. Well, Henry Clay, is going to come in and help out and solve the issue. He is the great compromiser, besides being the great war hawk, and he says, hey, what if we allow Maine, way up here in the far northeast, to come in as a free state, Maine free. Missouri can then come in as a slave state, and we can maintain that balance now at 12 to 12. And then one other key provision of the Missouri Compromise is the line, the 3630 line. As you know, the world is divided up into lines of latitude and longitude. This line here, 3630, runs all the way across, and the Missouri Compromise said that all future states made out of the Louisiana Territory, right here, all future states that are north of 3630 will be free, and states south of 3630 from now on will be slave. So the balance is able to get maintained, and Henry Clay comes to the rescue to save the day. And then another key issue, 1824, we're going to have an election. Well, James Monroe has served 2 terms and is going to decide not to run again in 1824. And so we're going to see 4 different men run. John Quincy Adams, Andrew Jackson, William Crawford, and Henry Clay. These 4 men run. Now, if you recall, the Federalist Party is dead. There's only one political party, and that is the Democratic Republicans. So these 4 men run. You can see up here on the Electoral College map here how the election turned out. We had Jackson with 99 electoral votes, John Quincy Adams with 84, William Crawford 41, and Henry Clay with 37. Well, according to the Constitution, when there is a tie, the vote goes, or when not a tie, but when no one gets a majority. And if you see here, Jackson would have had to have gotten 131 electoral votes to get a majority. Well, he has the most votes, but certainly not a majority of votes. So when there's no majority, it goes to the House of Representatives. And in this case, the top 3 candidates get to go. So unfortunately, that's going to leave Henry Clay out. And so we're going to have a runoff in the House of Reps between John Quincy Adams, Andrew Jackson, and William Crawford. Well, of course, Andrew Jackson thinks I should become president. Why? Because I got the most electoral votes. But that's not what's going to happen. That's not going to happen. So, what happens is that Henry Clay, kind of pictured right here, and John Quincy Adams are going to make a deal. They're going to make a corrupt bargain, or that's what Andrew Jackson is going to call it. This corrupt bargain says, John Quincy says, hey, Henry Clay, if you swing your support to me, then I will make you Secretary of State. Why is that important to become Secretary of State? Well, let's look back in history real quick. Thomas Jefferson had been George Washington's Secretary of State, then became president. James Madison had been Thomas Jefferson's Secretary of State, then became president. James Monroe had been Madison's Secretary of State, became president. John Quincy Adams, you get the pattern here, right? Had been Secretary of State to James Monroe. So now Quincy Adams is going to win. Henry Clay is going to swing his support to Quincy Adams. All of his supporters, Clay's, will now vote for Quincy Adams, and John Quincy Adams becomes our next president with Henry Clay as his Secretary of State. Clay, of course, hoping to use that springboard to become the next president after Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams' presidency was pretty low-key. Not a lot took place. He invested a lot of money into the arts and sciences and education. He's actually the one that began the Smithsonian Museums, that we'll be visiting a number of them during the trip. But overall had a pretty uneventful presidency. He was a much better Secretary of State than he was president. And this speeds along. During the 4 years of his presidency is kind of tumultuous. Andrew Jackson is very, very bitter over the corrupt bargain. So he's going to challenge him again for the presidency in 1828. And this time, Andrew Jackson's going to win. But we see a real couple key important new things in 1828. One, we see 2 political parties getting created. We see, if you notice here, the Jacksonian Democrats and Andrew Jackson, Democratic Party. John Quincy Adams, the National Republican Party, the Republicans. These 2 parties get formed here. That era of good feelings is over with. We now have political parties, and this campaign is filled with parades and barbecues and speeches and mudslinging. A lot of throwing each other under the bus, saying a lot of mean things about each other because they both wanted to win desperately. Jackson will win. You see there by a pretty good amount, 178 electoral votes to 83, 68% overall.